Hey everyone, welcome to Political Radar Echo, 30 minutes of political talk about current topics with panelists from a variety of viewpoints. I'm your host, Cassandra Hautala, and this week we are talking about the removal of Confederate monuments and statues.
This is Political Radar Echo with Cassandra Hautala, where we cover many political issues affecting our country with a panel of guests from many viewpoints.
Before we get started, make sure that you are subscribing on YouTube to our channel. We put out new videos about once a week, so subscribe, check it out. So before we get started, make sure you hit that button. I have two panelists with me today. I have Jacob Immel and I have Kia Murray. So if you would like to introduce yourself real quick. Kia?
Yep. So my name is Kia Murray. I am a student at UW Green Bay studying political science and communication as well as public relations and journalism.
Hi, I'm Jacob Immel, recent graduate of UW Green Bay on the Brown County Planning Commission and a real estate agent in the area.
All right. So these two actually approached me with the topic, which I think is a really great topic. So I did a little research. I've always had my own opinions on it, and we talked a little bit about it before the show. So I want to give you each a chance to talk about what are your thoughts as we get started. Actually, I'm sorry. I had mentioned something before this. Before we get started, I do want to send out my thoughts to the people in Texas who are currently being affected by a hurricane. And I want to encourage everyone to look for our local charity. Maybe the Red Cross is probably the best place to start. If you have a little bit of a monetary donation, that's usually the best place to start. They can use that. They have buying power. They can get supplies. So just sending my thoughts out to the people in Texas. So before we get started, either of you want to say anything about that? Or
Yeah, encouraging individuals, small businesses, anything that you can give helps. I know they're struggling with just easy access to things like water and hygiene products and toiletries. So any kind of donation is there's always grateful for it.
I think just also be careful where you're donating. Make sure it is to a reputable organization like the Red Cross, because I did see that there are some scams of people trying to, of course, trying to exploit this. So just be knowledgeable about what organization and what they do.
And I really hope that our government can kind of get themselves together and eventually we can learn how to handle hurricanes. I certainly hope that. So, we're going to let Jacob turn off his phone. Okay. All right. So
somebody wanted to give me their thoughts on the topic
right.
today.
So let's get started. Who wants to start?
I'll let Jacob go ahead.
Confederate monuments. Confederate monuments. Jacob.
Okay. So I'll briefly talk about our position. So the great thing about this is that Key and I might have different opinions on this, but I think one thing that's missing in a lot of discourse now, especially with politics, is the respectful discourse. And seeing as we are good friends, I'm excited to bring that to the table. So I think let's just first introduce our opinions briefly, and I'm going to take the camp of that we should keep Confederate monuments. And before you send me hate mail, in the mail for that, I guess I just briefly want to
We won't give out your address.
Yikes. I just briefly want to elaborate on why I feel that way. I do not condone, I do not support at all the actions that the statues represent, nor do I represent or support the history, but the only reason I do support that we keep the statues is that I believe that the approach to take them down does not do enough in terms of the conversation. So I feel that while we need to combat what those statues represent in the monuments, taking them down just simply would not be the best way. And I'll explain why I feel that way shortly.
All right.
Okay. And so as Jacob mentioned, I have an opposing view. I do think that they should be taken down for the reason that we already decided the Confederacy is wrong, right? Everything that they stand for is wrong, and the absence of civil rights for not only just African Americans, but other minorities, that's wrong. And these statues, they represent the people who encouraged that kind of behavior, that kind of legislation, and that kind of oppression. And so I think the first step in making it very public that is not acceptable anymore is taking these statues down. And I think that's how the conversation can at least start.
Okay. All right. Well, poor Jacob. He's the minority here because I agree with you, Kia. I do think that they need to be taken down. Mm-hmm. But I guess where do we start? I was telling both of you about a speech that I think everyone should watch that was given on May 19th by the New Orleans mayor, Mitch Landrieu. And I encourage all of the people watching today to check that out, and maybe I can put a link in the show notes. But I guess starting with, we're talking about statues that memorialize the Civil War, right?
Right.
Okay. That was 4 years in our history.
Mm-hmm.
4 years in our history. Why, Jacob, why should we be memorializing this 4-year little blip in our history? Not a little blip. I mean, it was a huge part of our history, but it's really just 4 years in our history. And these were traitors to our nation. So my question to you is that I don't want to attack you or anything, but why would we memorialize traitors to our nation?
Sure, and I think that this is a hard topic to talk about, and I think especially if you have an opinion maybe that is mine, it is really hard to talk about. So I think, first of all, what we need to do is we need to reframe the argument, right? We kind of need to flip around how we're looking at it. So one of the ways that I'm looking at it as not supporting what they represent, but reframing the conversation of how we view it and what we're viewing the statues, what they represent. So for me, I think we need to view this as a cautionary tale of what they represent and how we can do our best to make sure, especially with racial tensions at such a high, as you've seen in Charlottesville, and if you've seen, with the administration and the opposing party, I think that we need to have a cautionary tale of what we can do to make sure that we don't continue to fan the flames of racial tension. And also, kind of the inverse of that, we also don't want to whitewash history and the fact that, for me, the reason that people want to get rid of the statues, I get that, but it's almost the inverse effect that if we do get rid of these statues, we're kind of changing the conversation. We're kind of changing what happened with history. I think it's a slippery slope. If we do this, what are we going to do next? If you look at Charlottesville shortly after, the Lincoln Memorial was vandalized. Well, should we take down the Lincoln Memorial? Should we change our currency and who's on our currency? A great example that I think of is FDR, a great president respected by many. In 1942, he signed a proclamation that made internment camps the law of the land. 120,000 Japanese Americans were brutalized and put in these camps like dogs. And yet a lot of people view him as a progressive hero for a good reason, but should we be taking down his statue? And I get it is a slippery slope, but we need to be careful that by doing this one instance, it doesn't have a curtail effect.
But when we put those statues up, didn't we kind of whitewash history by putting them up? By saying that we were putting them up because they were standing up to the federal government. They were rebels. Doesn't it kind of whitewash the fact that they were fighting to keep slavery?
Well, these are some good questions. I think one way to look at the Civil War and one way to look at this issue now is that it is a government control, right? So obviously the Civil War had a lot to do about racism, of course. I'm not going to dispute that fact. But it was a states' right issue versus a federal government issue. And I think that is a lot of the issue today. Do I support taking down statues? Well, going a little further with this discussion, I believe in local control. So if we're looking at local versus federal control, if local municipalities and governments and their citizens do feel that it is in the best interest to bring it down once it's consulted in a democracy, that's a different issue than a lot of what the media is doing. They're framing it as a federal issue, and they're having national parties, national figures looking at this issue when it doesn't even apply to them.
I can understand that. And again, I would really encourage people to watch that speech by Mitch Landrieu, because he does talk about that, about how in New Orleans they went about this locally. They started at the local level, at the city council, and they looked at it from so many different angles. They had different committees, and it was really a local thing to take these down. And those statues are in such a prominent area. They were in such a prominent area in New Orleans, in the French Quarter. which when I visited the city, I remember going there as a teenager the first time and thinking, what in the world? Why is there a statue of Robert E. Lee? Didn't they lose? Right? They lost. They lost the war. So, Kia, I want to give you a chance to kind of react
Dispute me.
Dispute Jacob.
Well, I've got a couple of points based on what you said, and the first time I want to touch on is the fact that with it being a national issue or a local issue, and I think it's a little bit of both. What you have to realize is, I mean, when we talk about the issues going on in Charlottesville, right, that was something that was happening in Virginia, but it was dealt with on a national scale. Why? Because it's a national problem. And so when you talk about having these statues up, like you said, in New Orleans in prominent areas, you have to think about what that means to the community members that are there and that are viewing those. And so you have minorities in these areas where these statues are in, and they're walking past and they're seeing that their government it's symbolically honoring what we've already decided is wrong. You're taking these statues, and they represent people that encourage oppression, and they represent people that encourage African Americans and other minorities not being treated as humans, being a third of a human. I mean, we've already decided that's wrong. Jim Crow laws, wrong. Swastikas, wrong. The KKK, wrong. And then you have these people that openly and publicly support that, and then you build monuments for them, and you keep them up. I mean, what does that say to the community members that were oppressed? It says that you're memorializing values that we've already decided need to be done away with.
Right, and you brought up a point there about when these statues were built. Do either of you know, like when did a large number of these statues come up? It wasn't during Reconstruction. It wasn't right after the war.
Both did our historical research.
Well, based on what I found, I was under the impression that a lot of these statues were put up directly after the war so that people could have a way to, quote unquote, maintain their pride and maintain the pride that they had in the Confederacy, and for, you know, these families that had these soldiers go off to war and fight for what we've already decided is the wrong side. And so with that being said, why are we maintaining pride and prejudice? What is the purpose of that? And then you have to think again, what does that mean for other minorities, not just African Americans, but what does that mean for those who were directly affected, whose families and generations have been affected and continue to be affected and will continue to be affected by the values that these people encouraged and supported.
Right, and there's been talk about generational trauma, you know, that follows, that the effects of slavery can be felt in people today. So that another topic, but
I'd like to add a little bit about the historical context, if I could. Did some research. Fascinating. There's over 700 monuments in the United States that have some sort of Confederate memorabilia. So these facts, I didn't make it up from fake news or anything. This is from, according to the Southern Poverty Law Center. An interesting thing, the majority of the statues, I mean, some, like Kia said, were shortly after the war and during Reconstruction, but the majority actually were built between 1920 and 1900, and 1920s. And what's really actually fascinating is that 31 states have Confederate monuments and statues, but only 11 states were in the Confederacy. So I just find that, I guess I don't know why that is, I just find that's intriguing to me.
Mm-hmm. That part is interesting. But let's think about 1900 to 1920. What was happening at that time?
Right.
That was the rise of the KKK, right? That was where all of that started. That was the Jim Crow laws. So were these erected really to, Jacob, what do you think? Were they erected really to memorialize and to talk about the loss of the soldiers? Yeah, it's very sad that all of these people died in the Civil War. It was a very deadly war, and it's very sad. But we need to remember, too, that whether it's sad that they died, they still died fighting for the wrong cause. It's the same as the Nazi soldiers. I'm sorry, the Nazi soldiers died fighting for the wrong cause. And if you go to Germany, you're not going to find memorials to Hitler and
Stalin
the Nazi the soldiers. And as we discussed, when I went to the Soviet Union and I was there when it fell, one of the first things that happened was they took down the statues of Stalin. They took down the statues of Lenin. So, okay. So what do we do? What do we do with them? I understand your thoughts that we need to reframe it, that we need to look at, and we don't want to forget about that history. Obviously, we don't want to forget it. We don't want to act like it didn't happen. I don't think that's where anyone would want to go with this. But how do we do this in a way that we take away the pain of, the little girl walking past the statue every day on her way to school, and seeing that and seeing a symbol of oppression? How do we do that?
Well, I think the best way to learn from history is to actually study it so you don't repeat it. So I think one way is to keep the statues to learn from the history. For example, and going back to this issue of, I guess, whitewashing, if you look at some of the most literary classics in America, there's racial undertones. And, do we still read Huckleberry Finn in schools? Do we read it because we support the racism that is in the book? Do we do it to mimic it, or do we do it to learn from literature, from history books? And I think that, again, not supporting what the statues represent, just looking at the bigger picture of how we can reignite the conversation. And I just think a little interesting, kind of going back to the statistic of the majority was constructed in 1900s, 1920s. I think that a lot of times we want to make it a Democrat-Republican issue. And it's not, and it shouldn't be. Republicans are not inherently racist, but, I guess one way to bring up this issue is 1900s, 1920s, there was overwhelmingly Democratic control, whether it be in the legislators, whether it be in local parties, local union houses. So, let's go back to that historical a little bit. Like, why did our government allow that to happen? So right now we're talking about, well, now the government should step in and take the statues. Well, again, let's reframe the argument. Why did the government let these statues be erected in the first place?
Well, but we're also 100 years out. And do we learn 100 years from now, as we get further away from an event, from a major historical event? I think every generation can reframe how they see it and can come away with a deeper understanding of it and a deeper understanding of what it really did and what it really meant. So I don't know if 1900 to 1920, and we could get into the Democrats and Republicans and what they stood for back then. That,
Right.
Again, another topic,
Right.
and I
Let's
don't
do
disagree.
that. Let's do that show. That'd be amazing.
I don't disagree with you there. But what have we learned in the past 100 years?
Well, a couple of things. I mean, first of all, if we want to talk about not making it a Democratic or Republican issue, the first thing is that we can't highlight that it was the Democratic Party that was, in the majority while they were coming up. No, I mean, and that's what I mean that. I mean, if we're going to say that, it's not, one side or the other is just inherently racist, then what will be the purpose of highlighting, but the Democrats were in power when
just
these
trying to play the
statues came
game.
up. And then furthermore, we talk about what's going on in the 1900s and 1920s. To say, that there were only 11 states that were included in the Confederacy. And then there were 31 states that have these Confederate soldiers, as monuments, right? Well, then you have to think about, what happened between the end of the Civil War and then putting up these monuments? If maintaining pride was one of the reasons that these statues started to pop up in the first place, well, then what are you saying to other people? You're saying that it's okay to be comfortable in supporting these values that we've already decided are wrong and that lack legitimacy and that lack validity. And so you're putting one side and saying that, we said you're wrong, but it's okay to take pride in what you believe in. And I think that is even reflected in what happened in Charlottesville. I mean, I think it's very problematic, and it should concern every viewer and every person and every American citizen that you have someone that considers themselves to have American pride and patriotism by waving a flag with a swastika. That should worry you. And so that's what I mean when we should take down these Confederate statues that are honoring Confederate soldiers. You're honoring what they stood for. And that's what a statue is. A statue is symbolically representing what they stood for, and saying that it has a permanent place in our country, and it doesn't. And we decided that generations ago. And so that's how you start the conversation. You make it uncomfortable for people to take pride in the Confederacy and values that oppress other
Right.
people.
And a lot of sorry, I just wanted to point out too that there was an increase at that time of statues. The next boom came in the 50s and 60s. So
Right.
so let's
Civil
look at
rights
what was
movement.
happening. Right, the civil rights movement. So are we really looking at we have pride in these people, or are we looking at putting up statues to remind people, hey, we're in charge? That's the way I view it. It was a intimidation factor. It wasn't about pride. It was about reminding people that no, you don't deserve these rights. You don't. We're still in charge. So, what do you think? I mean, if we look at the two big booms, and I saw a graph that had that had the big boom of them being built at the Jim Crow era, and then the next one during the civil rights movement. So how do we explain that as pride? I don't know.
Well, I think. Oh, sorry.
Yeah, I'll let you respond.
So I think, obviously, if anybody is still insinuating pride from these horrific events, I mean, you really need to check yourself. It is 2017, all the progress we've made. But, of course, people would say, oh, well, obviously we're keeping the statues. If we keep the statues, does that reinforce this racist pride? Well, obviously, as we mentioned, parties evolved, people evolved. Races have evolved. In general, people have. So what we viewed as pride, now we should be able to, history is uncomfortable. And I think that these conversations need to be had. And I think that talking about uncomfortable things, and for many, these statues are a reminder of horrific events, which rightfully so, yes. But let's move away from looking to them as symbols of pride, but looking to them as symbols of discomfort and uncomfort for further activism. I think that we should continue to be more progressive on issues like this, but how are we supposed to learn if we're not faced with discomfort? One thing I just briefly want to add historically, so a lot of the conversation was about Jefferson Davis and Robert E. Lee in terms of their memorial and their statue. After the war, these two are obviously the leaders of the Confederacy and the more well-known, and a lot of people that have pride, it stems from them. You could say, well, I think it's interesting that after the war ended, they both came out and said that, it was deplorable. The war was deplorable. What we stood for was horrendous. And I think that's talking about the evolution of how people evolve and getting on the right side of history. We need to acknowledge that these people were wrong. What they did was wrong. They fought for the wrong side of history, but they realized that the tides were changing and that they were on the wrong side, and they acknowledged it. And I think that is something to look at as well, and that's a momentous coming to Jesus moment.
It's interesting too because I found something that said that ironically Robert E. Lee was actually against monuments. He felt that they were basically keeping open the sores of a past war. So it's interesting that we're talking about statues of this man who really didn't even believe in having those.
Right.
So I guess we probably need to wrap up here a little bit. It's such a complicated issue, but how do we move forward? Can we keep these monuments someplace else? Can we do something with them that doesn't destroy them and doesn't take away the history and doesn't take away the things that we need to remember that make us uncomfortable so it doesn't happen again?
And you definitely can. I think with every problem that you face, you should be looking for a solution. I always say it's not enough just to talk about it, but you have to bring something to the table. What is a solution? And I think one of the things that we can do to alleviate what happens when you keep these monuments up, put them where they belong. You don't have statues in the community that represent those kind of values and expect that that's what's going to move people forward. Right? If they're historical, then put them where history belongs, in museums, so that you can continue the education and so that we can learn from our past. I mean, I don't think, first of all, demolishing statues is not going to keep people from remembering what happened to an entire group of people. No one is going to forget the enslavement of African Americans because you took down Confederate soldiers. That's not what's going to happen. And that's why I don't find a lot of validity or legitimacy in the erasing history argument that a lot of people are using with the removal of the statues. So put them in museums, not prominent in the community where people are, like you said, open sores, where people who are oppressed by the values that those monuments represent And they're looking at that every day because that's a form of intimidation, and it's very uncomfortable. And it's almost like a form of bullying. Put them in museums where you go to learn about your history. So those who don't know their history, they're doomed to repeat it, right? That's what we always say.
Right.
So put them where history belongs, in the museums, so that people can continue to teach African American history, as well as the history of other minorities that have built what America is today.
In Hungary, they actually made a park out of the monuments from the communist days. So they actually have like a park where you can go and like walk around. I was reading about that, and it's almost become kind of like a kitschy type place that people like to go and learn about that history. But you're making the choice. I think at that point you're making the choice. You know what you're walking into. You're not having to walk past something that's uncomfortable for you every day. So I guess there's no easy solutions here.
Closing statement?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah,
Oh,
I was
okay.
going to give you a chance. I really hope that I thought that something that the New Orleans mayor said was really interesting and hopeful. He said, at this point, we need to reclaim these spaces for the United States of America, for our country, for all of us, and we all pledge to one flag. And I'm sure he was referring to the fact that, you know, there's still people out there carrying around Confederate flags. That's, again, another topic. But I have to agree with him. I think we need to reclaim these spaces, and we need to put history where it belongs. So, you know, I agree with you. Jacob, you've brought a lot of interesting ideas and history to this, so I really appreciate that. I appreciate you sitting here in the middle. You know, you really did a great job, but I want to give you a chance to kind of finish up and give us your final thoughts too.
Well, first thing, I just wanted to tell everybody, because there's going to be some Facebook haters probably.
I hope not.
I'm a nice guy.
No.
Like, if you want to talk, please don't insult me or my mother or someone on Facebook. She's a beautiful lady.
No, I will not tolerate that, because
Just talk to me, message me.
Right.
I'm cute, I guess. I don't know. I'm just kidding. So I guess just one thing I wanted to, well, two things I just wanted to briefly bring up in conclusion. First of all, you know, just in conclusion, I don't think that taking down the statues is solving the issue of racial tension, racial divide. Of course, you can make the argument that it's a step, and very well it could be a step. But for me, I think that we need to make, for lack of a better term, we need to make these douchebags of history, right? We need to make them visible. We need people to know how horrendous they were. They're on the wrong side of history because, like you mentioned, otherwise we are doomed to repeat history. So, you know, if we do want to, let's say that we do want to build new statues, well, then let's build new statues of civil rights leaders. I think that would be something that both sides could agree on. But in general, kind of what I was talking about, we need to let history speak on these people being on the wrong side of history. For example, a lot of injustices are not taught in schools. Obviously, we talk about racial divides and racial tension, which is, of course, needed, and I'm glad we talk about it. But we don't talk about the genocide of the Native Americans that we did in this country, that Caucasian people did. We don't talk about that. And kind of going to an earlier point, we did not talk about, at least I didn't know until college, which is sad, the internment camps that we built here on our soil to lock up Japanese Americans. We do not talk about these things enough. And yes, I'm not saying that one is greater than the other. That's not my argument. I'm saying that we need to make injustice known. And for me, I just don't think taking down the statues is the way to do it. I think there's so much more that we could do. So.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. I felt the same thing when I learned about the Japanese internment camp. I was also in college. So that was kind of a shock to my system. I've made sure to teach my daughter about that at an early age, and because again, we don't want to me, that was always ironic that we were over there fighting the Nazis, putting people in concentration camps, and we were not doing much better over here. So yeah, any other thoughts as we
My
wrap
closing
up?
thought would just to be, and just to recap what I've said. I mean, removing these statues, you have to think about what a statue is. It's symbolism. It's memorializing. And when we think about the effect that that has on community members, especially minorities, it's inappropriate. That's not where it belongs. And so you have to do what you can do, and you do your part in making sure that those who say, certain groups of people don't deserve rights and certain groups of people don't deserve, the treatment that are being treated equally. I think that you have to make it very clear that it's not what's tolerated and it's not acceptable, and you ought to be uncomfortable rather than running around with swastika flags and calling yourself patriotic. You have to put them in a place of discomfort.
And I always wonder too, I've been to New Orleans many times, and where are the memorials to the many slaves that came through there? Where are the memorials to the people who were lynched in their own yards? Where are those? Where are those memorials? I see giant memorials to Confederate.
Well, I said it. Let's build more. Let's build more.
Yeah, and you did say that. You
symbolize civil rights.
Right. You did say that. Maybe we need to focusing on the future. Maybe we need to work on doing things like that. Is that enough, or do we take down the ones and replace them with other ones? So
at the end of the day, I think, talking about taking down, leaving statues, I think what we're doing here today is so awesome and so great that we can come as friends, as people that are committed and care about our communities, that we can talk and we can have these tough conversations and we don't hate each other, right?
No.
We're still friends, and I think that's what this country really needs, is coming together to talk about these tough conversations.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, e pluribus unum from many. We are one, and
Yes.
and we need to get together and talk about these things, and not do it carrying torches and
Agreed.
hurting people and killing people. So more of this, less of that, I would say, and we move forward. So we could talk forever about this, but unfortunately we are out of time, so I have to finish up. So that ends Political Radar Echo, episode 13. Thank you both for coming on. Really enjoyed the conversation.
No problem.
Both of you. For show notes, go to politicalradarecho.com/13. If you're watching this on YouTube, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell for notifications. For more great political content, check out Political Radar Pulse. And if you'd like to support this show, you can like it on Facebook, join the Political Radar Echo community on Facebook, and you can buy shirts and other merchandise at politicalradar.com/shop.
Thanks for watching Political Radar Echo. To ensure that you'll never miss an episode, subscribe on YouTube or your favorite podcast app. To check out more episodes of Political Radar Echo, visit politicalradarecho.com or connect with us on Facebook or Twitter.